Picture this. It's August 1596. You're aboard a wooden ship in the Arctic Ocean, hundreds of miles from any human settlement. The temperature is dropping fast, and then you hear it. A sound like thunder, but worse. The ice is closing in. Captain, the ice fields are moving. William Barentsz, the 46-year-old Dutch navigator, gripped the ship's railing as massive sheets of ice groaned and scraped against the hull of their vessel. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not yet. Not here. For weeks, Barentsz and his crew of 17 men had been pushing northward past the frozen archipelago of Novaya Zemlya, searching for the Northeast Passage, that legendary sea route over Russia that would make them rich beyond measure. The Dutch Republic would control trade with China and the Indies. They would be heroes, but now they were about to become prisoners. "We need to turn south now!" shouted Gerrit de Veer, the ship's officer and chronicler. He was a practical man, quick-thinking, and right now his instincts were screaming danger. Barentsz shook his head slowly, scanning the horizon. Ice stretched in every direction, glittering under the pale Arctic sun. "There is no south anymore, Gerrit. Look." The crew gathered on deck, their faces draining of color as they witnessed what their captain already knew. The ice wasn't just surrounding them, it was building walls. Thick, jagged plates of frozen seawater were grinding together, pushed by currents they couldn't see or understand. The path they'd sailed through just hours ago had vanished completely. "Holy Mother of God," whispered Jan Huygen van Linschoten, one of the expedition's merchants. "We're sealed in." It happened faster than anyone could have imagined. One moment they were navigating through loose ice floes. The next, they were locked in a death grip. The ship lurched violently as pressure built against the hull. Wood creaked and groaned. Several crew members stumbled, catching themselves on whatever they could grab. "All hands, secure everything below deck!" Barentz's voice cut through the rising panic. "And someone get me a reading on our position." They were near the northeastern tip of Novaya Zemlya, in a desolate bay that would later be named Ice Haven. But there was nothing haven-like about it now. The temperature was plummeting as August gave way to September. Soon, the sun would barely rise above the horizon. And after that, polar night would swallow them whole. "Captain," de Veer approached quietly, speaking low so the others wouldn't hear. "How long can we survive out here?" Barentsz met his officer's eyes. In them, he saw the same calculation he'd been running in his own mind. Their supplies were meant for a summer voyage, not a winter siege. They had some salted meat, hardtack, dried peas, and a small amount of wine and beer. Enough for perhaps 2 months if they were careful. Maybe 3. "We'll make it work," Barentsz said firmly. "We've survived worse." That was a lie, and both men knew it. They'd never survived anything close to this. The next few days brought a horrible realization. The ice wasn't melting. In fact, it was growing thicker. The crew took turns trying to hack through it with axes and saws, hoping to free the ship. They worked until their hands bled through their gloves, until exhaustion forced them to stop. They barely made a dent. "It's no use," shouted Klaus Gerritz, the ship's carpenter, throwing down his axe in frustration. "We might as well be chopping at mountain stone." That night, huddled in the ship's cabin with a single lantern flickering between them, the officers held a grim council. "Winter is coming," said the pilot Jacob Heemskerk, a young man who'd proven himself capable on previous voyages. "We all know what that means this far north." "Perpetual darkness," de Veer added. "Temperatures that freeze your breath before it leaves your mouth. We've heard the stories from Russian hunters." "Stories?" Barentsz interrupted. "None of us know what an Arctic winter truly means. No European has ever survived one this far north." The silence that followed was heavy as lead. "Then we'll be the first," Barentsz continued, his voice steady despite the fear he felt gnawing at his gut. "We have tools. We have weapons. There's driftwood on the shore. I saw it when we first entered the bay. We can build a shelter." "A shelter?" Linschoten laughed bitterly. "Captain, with respect, we're not settlers, we're sailors. We know nothing about surviving on land in these conditions." "Then we'll learn." Barentsz stood up, his tall frame filling the low cabin. "Because the alternative is dying aboard this ship when the cold becomes unbearable. Gentlemen, this vessel is a wooden box. Once the polar night arrives, it will become a frozen tomb. Our only chance is to get off this ship and build something that can keep us alive. Another crew member, Hans Voss, spoke up from the corner. And if the ice breaks up, if the ship is freed? Then we sail home immediately, Barentsz replied. But we cannot count on that, we must prepare for the worst. Through the cabin walls they could hear the ice groaning again. That terrible supernatural sound, like the Arctic itself, was speaking to them, warning them of what was coming. How long, someone asked. How long until we can expect rescue? Barentsz and De Veer exchanged glances. The truth was unbearable, no one was coming. No one even knew exactly where they were. And even if someone did, no ship could reach them through the ice. We rescue ourselves, Barentsz said quietly, or we don't get rescued at all. The full weight of their situation finally settled over the crew like a burial shroud. They were trapped in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, hundreds of miles beyond the edge of the known world. No rescue, no escape. And winter, true Arctic winter, was about to begin. Outside, the ice continued its relentless advance, grinding and groaning through the night. Their ordeal had only just begun. September 11, 1596, the decision was made. We go ashore at first light, Barentsz announced to the assembled crew on deck. We take everything we can carry, tools, weapons, provisions, and whatever lumber we can salvage. We have perhaps 3 weeks before the sun disappears entirely. The men stared back at him, their faces gaunt with worry. 3 weeks to build a shelter that could withstand an Arctic winter. It seemed impossible. What about the ship? Asked the boatswain, his voice cracking. We're just abandoning her? We're saving our lives, Barentsz replied. The ship will still be here in the spring. We won't be if we stay aboard. The following morning they began the grueling work of unloading supplies across the ice. Each man hauled loads on his back, slipping and stumbling over the frozen terrain toward the barren shore of Novaya Zemlya. The landscape was brutally alien, no trees, just endless stretches of ice, rock, and snow beneath a pale, indifferent sky. There, De Veer pointed toward a stretch of beach. Driftwood, the captain was right. It seemed like a miracle. Massive logs lay scattered along the shore, carried by ocean currents from the Russian forests far to the south. They were gray and weathered, but solid, enough to build with. God has not abandoned us, whispered Klaus Gerritz, making the sign of the cross. But God wasn't going to build their shelter. That was up to them. Barentsz organized the crew into teams. Some hauled driftwood, others dug into the frozen ground, trying to create a foundation. The carpenter, Gerritz, directed the construction with the precision of a man who knew this house would mean the difference between life and death. We need it partially underground, he explained, sketching in the snow with a stick. Earth insulation. The walls must be thick, double layered if we can manage it. And we need a proper chimney, or we'll suffocate from smoke before the cold gets us. The work was backbreaking. Men who'd spent their lives hauling rope and climbing rigging now swung axes and hammers with frozen fingers. Leather gloves provided little protection against tools that conducted the bitter cold straight into their bones. My hands, groaned one sailor, showing bloody cracks across his palms. I can barely grip anything anymore. Keep working, Heemskerk urged, though his own hands were in similar condition. We stop, we die. As they built, the Arctic revealed its savage beauty and terror. Polar bears appeared on the ice, massive white predators that showed no fear of humans. Sweet Jesus, look at the size of that beast. An enormous bear had wandered to within 50 yards of their construction site, standing on its hind legs to sniff the air. It was taller than any man, its black eyes fixed on the crew with cold calculation. Muskets now, Barentsz shouted. Several men grabbed their firearms, hands shaking as they loaded powder and shot. The bear dropped to all fours and began approaching slowly, methodically. Wait until it's closer, Barentsz instructed, his voice remarkably calm. We can't afford to waste ammunition. The bear came closer, 30 yards, 20. The crew could hear its breathing now, see the yellowed teeth in its massive jaws. Fire! 3 muskets erupted simultaneously. The bear roared, a sound that would haunt their nightmares, and charged. But one shot had found its mark. The beast stumbled, blood staining the white snow, and then collapsed just yards from where they stood. No one celebrated. They'd just learned a terrible lesson. They weren't alone out here, and they certainly weren't at the top of the food chain. That's our first meal, De Veer said, eyeing the dead bear. and will use its hide for insulation. Over the following days, the shelter slowly took shape. They named it Het Behouden Huis, the saved house. It measured roughly 33 feet long and 20 feet wide, with thick driftwood walls packed with moss and sand for insulation. The roof was covered with sailcloth salvaged from the ship, then layered with planks and anything else that might keep out the wind. But the cold was relentless. By late September, the temperature had dropped so low that the men's breath froze instantly, forming ice crystals in their beards and eyebrows. "I can't feel my toes," one sailor complained by the construction fire. "No one can," replied another grimly. "Just keep moving." The sun was sinking lower each day, barely cresting the horizon even at noon. The psychological weight of approaching darkness was almost worse than the cold. "When will it be finished?" Barentsz asked the carpenter one evening. Barentsz looked exhausted, his face wind-burned and aged beyond his years. "Another week if the weather holds. But Captain, I must be honest, I don't know if it will be enough. I've built fishing huts and storage sheds, never anything meant to keep men alive through a polar winter." "It will be enough," Barentsz said, clapping a hand on the man's shoulder, "because it has to be." On October 28th, the crew moved into Het Behouden Huis. It wasn't finished, but they had no choice. The ship had become uninhabitable, so cold that the wine in their barrels had frozen solid, and the men risked frostbite just sleeping below deck. Inside the house, they'd constructed sleeping bunks along the walls, built from ship's planks. A makeshift fireplace and chimney occupied one end. Supplies were stacked everywhere: barrels of salted meat, hardtack, ammunition, rope, tools. It was cramped, dark, and smelled of unwashed men and smoke. But it was shelter. "Home sweet home," De Vere muttered, ducking through the low doorway. That night, November 3rd, 1596, the sun disappeared below the horizon and didn't return. The polar night had begun. Inside Het Behouden Huis, the crew gathered around their meager fire. The driftwood burned poorly, producing more smoke than heat. The men huddled together, wrapped in every piece of clothing they owned, plus the bear hide they'd cured. "How long?" someone asked in the darkness. "How long until the sun comes back?" De Vere had been calculating. "Based on our latitude, approximately 3 months. 3 months of total darkness." The reality of it settled over them like a physical weight. No sunrise, no dawn, just endless frozen night. "We'll need to conserve lamp oil," Barentsz said quietly. "One lamp burning at all times for warmth and light, no more. We ration everything: food, fuel, wine, everything." "And what do we do?" asked Linschoten. "For 3 months? In the dark?" "We survive," Barentsz replied. "We tell stories, we play cards, we pray, we keep each other sane, and we prepare for the day the sun returns." But even as he spoke with confidence, Barentsz felt the fear gnawing at him. They'd taken the first step. They'd built shelter. But surviving was going to require more than walls and a roof. It was going to require hope. And in the endless Arctic darkness, hope was in dangerously short supply. December 1596. Inside Het Behouden Huis, 17 men existed in a twilight world that seemed divorced from reality. The single oil lamp cast dancing shadows on the driftwood walls. Outside, the wind howled like a living creature trying to tear their shelter apart. "What day is it?" asked one of the sailors, his voice hollow. De Vere checked his journal by the lamplight. He'd been meticulously recording everything: temperatures, food consumption, notable events. It was perhaps the only thing keeping his mind sharp. December 18th, Wednesday. "Wednesday," the sailor repeated as if the word had lost all meaning. Time had become their enemy. In the perpetual darkness, days blurred together. Men slept at odd hours, woke disoriented, and couldn't tell if they'd been unconscious for 2 hours or 12. The only structure in their lives was the daily ration distribution. "Morning meal," Barentsz announced, though morning was purely theoretical. Each man received his portion: a piece of hardtack, ship's biscuit so hard it had to be soaked in melted snow before eating, a small chunk of salted meat, and a cup of watered-down wine. They'd already reduced rations twice. The supplies weren't going to last as long as they'd hoped. "This is what we're calling a meal." Klaus Gerritz stared at his meager portion. "This is what keeps us alive until spring," Barentsz replied firmly. But spring felt like a myth. a story they told themselves to ward off despair. The cold was incomprehensible. Even inside the shelter, huddled around the fire, the men could see their breath. Water placed near the fire froze on the side facing away from the flames. Their bedding, their clothes, everything became stiff with ice crystals formed from the moisture of their own bodies. "My blanket feels like sheet metal," one sailor complained, trying to wrap himself in fabric frozen into rigid shapes. Worse than the cold was the smoke. The driftwood burned poorly, and the chimney, despite Barentsz's best efforts, didn't draw properly. Smoke filled the shelter constantly, burning their eyes and throats. "We're being slowly poisoned," DeVere wrote in his journal. "The smoke is as dangerous as the cold, but we cannot let the fire go out. Without it, we would freeze solid within hours." Then the sickness began. "Captain," Heemskerk approached Barentsz one night, his voice urgent but low. "It's starting, look." He pulled back his sleeve. Even in the dim lamplight, the signs were unmistakable. His gums were bleeding, dark bruises blossomed across his skin, and his teeth had begun to loosen. Scurvy. Barentz's heart sank. He knew what this meant. Without fresh food, without vitamin C, scurvy would ravage the crew. Men would lose their teeth, their wounds would stop healing, old injuries would reopen. Eventually, they would simply bleed to death internally. "How many others?" Barentsz asked. "At least 6 showing symptoms, probably more who haven't said anything yet." Within weeks, nearly the entire crew was afflicted. Men groaned in their bunks, too weak to move. Blood stained their bedding. The shelter began to smell not just of smoke and unwashed bodies, but of sickness and decay. "We're dying," Linschoten said bluntly one night during an officers' meeting. "Slowly, but dying nonetheless." "We still have time," Barentsz insisted. "The sun will return in February. When it does, we hunt fresh meat. Arctic foxes, seabirds if we're lucky. Fresh meat will cure the scurvy." "If we survive until February," DeVere added quietly. The psychological toll was as brutal as the physical suffering. Grown men wept in the darkness. Arguments erupted over trivial matters, whose turn it was to tend the fire, who was taking more than their share of the sleeping space, whether someone had stolen an extra sip of wine. "Enough!" Barentsz roared one night when 2 sailors nearly came to blows over a perceived slight. "We are not animals. We are men. We are Dutchmen, and by God we will act like it." The shelter fell silent. "Every one of us is suffering," Barentsz continued, his voice softer now. "Every one of us is frightened, but we cannot turn on each other. If we do that, we might as well walk out into the ice and let it have us now." Garrett DeVere stood up slowly. "The captain is right, we must hold together. I suggest we resume our evening readings." They'd brought books, the Bible certainly, but also some secular texts. Each evening someone would read aloud by the lamplight while the others listened. It gave them something to focus on beyond their misery, a connection to the civilized world they'd left behind. But reading required oil for lamps, and their oil was running dangerously low. "We need to go outside more," Heemskerk suggested during one strategy session. "Hunt for food, gather more driftwood before it's completely buried in snow." "In this darkness?" another officer protested. "We can't see 5 feet in front of our faces." "Then we use torches. We can't just sit here and wait to die." They did venture out, though it was terrifying. The darkness was so complete it felt solid, like they were moving through black water. The cold attacked instantly, finding any gap in their clothing and driving ice-cold daggers into their flesh. On one expedition, they encountered another polar bear. In the darkness, lit only by their torches, it was like confronting a demon. "Don't run," Barentsz commanded. "Stay together. Weapons ready." The bear circled them, a massive white shadow just beyond the torchlight. They could hear it breathing, smell its wild musk. For several terrifying minutes, neither side moved. Then, inexplicably, the bear turned and vanished into the darkness. "God was with us," one sailor whispered, making the sign of the cross with trembling hands. "Or the bear wasn't hungry enough yet," DeVere replied grimly. They did manage to kill several Arctic foxes, and the fresh meat, however little, did seem to help the scurvy symptoms. But it wasn't enough. They needed more. They needed spring. January brought a new challenge. The alcohol froze. Their wine, which they'd been depending on for calories and morale, turned to ice in the barrels. "Even the wine has abandoned us," someone joked bitterly. They discovered that if they held chunks of frozen wine close to the fire, they could melt small amounts at a time. It became an evening ritual, men gathering around the fire with their pathetic pieces of frozen wine, waiting for just enough to melt for a single swallow. Barentsz himself was weakening. The scurvy had him in its grip, though he tried to hide it from the crew. De Vere noticed anyway. Everyone noticed, but no one spoke of it directly. Their captain had to remain strong, even if it was an illusion. They needed someone to believe in. "When the sun returns," Barentsz would say regularly, "we will see the ice break up. We will repair the ship. We will sail home." "When the sun returns," the men would echo like a prayer. But the question that haunted every man, spoken in whispers or not at all, was simple and terrible. Would they live long enough to see it? January 24, 1597. I see light on the horizon." The shout jerked every man in Het Behouden to attention. Those who could move scrambled for the door, stumbling over each other in the darkness. Where? "There, to the south." It was true. After months of absolute darkness, a faint glow touched the horizon, barely visible but unmistakably real. The sun impossibly was returning early. Praise God. Men wept openly, embracing each other. We're saved. But De Vere was troubled. He pulled out his navigational instruments and charts, checking and rechecking his calculations by lamplight. "Captain," he said quietly, pulling Barentsz aside, "this isn't right. By my calculations, the sun shouldn't be visible for another 2 weeks at least." "You're saying we're not seeing the sun?" Barentsz asked. "I'm saying we shouldn't be able to see it yet. Not from our latitude." What they'd witnessed was a phenomenon unknown to European science at the time. Atmospheric refraction. The Arctic air, layered with different temperatures and densities, had bent the sun's light around the curve of the Earth, making it visible before it should have been. But the crew didn't care about the science. They'd seen light, and that was enough. The psychological lift was immediate and profound. Men who'd been lying in their bunks, barely moving, suddenly found energy. They began going outside regularly, reveling in the twilight that gradually grew brighter each day. When the sun finally did rise fully in February, the entire crew assembled outside to witness it. "Never thought I'd be so happy to see that ball of fire," Garrett said, his voice choked with emotion. They were a sight to behold. 17 scarecrow figures, gaunt and bearded, many missing teeth, all wearing filthy layers of frozen clothing. But they were alive. They'd survived the polar night. Now came the next challenge, getting home. "We need to reach the ship," Barentsz announced. "Assess the damage and prepare her for sailing as soon as the ice breaks." The crew trekked across the frozen bay to where their vessel remained locked in ice. What they found was devastating. The ship's hull had been crushed in several places by ice pressure. The rigging was damaged beyond repair. Everything exposed to the elements was encased in thick ice. "Can it be fixed?" Barentsz asked the carpenter. Garretts walked slowly around the vessel, shaking his head. "Captain, I'm sorry. Even if we had all the materials we needed, even if we had a full crew of healthy men, this would take months to repair, and we have neither." "Then what do you suggest?" The carpenter pointed to the 2 small open boats they'd used to unload cargo months ago. They'd been stored inside Het Behouden, protected from the elements. "Those boats, they're seaworthy. If the ice breaks up enough for us to launch them, we could sail south along the coast until we reach Russian settlements or encounter a ship." "In open boats?" Heemskerk looked horrified. "Through Arctic waters? That's madness." "What's madness is staying here," De Vere interjected. "We've nearly exhausted our supplies. Another winter would kill us all." "If we can even survive that long," added another officer. "The scurvy will return the moment we run out of fresh meat." Barentsz stared at the ruined ship, their home, their lifeline, their ticket to wealth and glory. All of it destroyed by the ice. He felt exhaustion deep in his bones. The scurvy was worse than he'd admitted to anyone. Some days it was a struggle just to stand. "We prepare the boats," he said finally. "We wait for the ice to break and then we sail for home." March became April. April became May. The sun now circled above them endlessly. The polar day had begun, the mirror image of the darkness they'd endured. But the ice remained solid. The bay that had trapped them showed no signs of breaking up. "It's not going to melt in time," Lynn Schoten said during yet another somber meeting. "We could be here another full year." "We don't have supplies for another year," De Vere replied. "We barely have supplies for another month." "Then we leave now," Heemskerk said. "We drag the boats across the ice until we reach open water." "Drag them? They weigh—" "I know what they weigh, but what choice do we have?" The argument went in circles. Stay and hope the ice broke up? Leave immediately and risk everything on open boats in freezing water? Every option seemed designed to kill them in a different way. Finally, on June 13, 1597, nature made the decision for them. With a sound like artillery, the ice began to crack. The bay is breaking up!" Men rushed outside to witness great sheets of ice splitting apart, creating dark channels of open water between them. It was the most beautiful and terrifying thing they'd ever seen. "We leave tomorrow," Barentsz declared. "At first light. Pack everything we can carry: food, water, weapons, navigational instruments. Everything else stays behind." That final night in Het Behoudenhuis was subdued. The shelter that had saved their lives now felt like a prison they were desperate to escape. Yet leaving it felt like stepping off a cliff into the unknown. "I never thought I'd miss this smoke-filled box," one sailor admitted. "Neither did I," replied another. "But I'd rather die trying to go home than die waiting in the dark." De Vere walked around the interior, documenting everything in his journal one last time. The bunks where they'd suffered, the fireplace that had kept them alive, the tally marks carved into the wall counting the endless days. "Someone might find this place," he explained to Barentsz. "In years to come, they should know what happened here." "They'll know," Barentsz replied quietly. "Your chronicle will tell them everything." The next morning, June 14, 1597, the crew of 17 men loaded into 2 small open boats. They had meager supplies, some dried meat, hard biscuit, a little wine, and their determination to survive. "Gentlemen," Barentsz stood in the bow of the first boat, his voice carrying across the ice-strewn water. "What we are about to attempt has never been done. But then again, we have already done what has never been done. We survived an Arctic winter. God has brought us this far. He will see us home." "To home!" the crew shouted, their voices echoing off the ice. "To home," Barentsz repeated softly. The boats pushed off into the dark water, navigating carefully between grinding ice floes. Behind them, Het Behoudenhuis stood silent on the barren shore, a monument to human endurance that would remain untouched for nearly 300 years. The open boats were tiny specks on a vast, hostile ocean. 17 exhausted men rowing and sailing south along the coast of Novaya Zemlya, navigating through ice fields that could crush their fragile vessels in seconds. "Keep the boats close together," Barentsz called from the lead boat. "If one gets separated, we'll never find each other again." The cold was just as brutal as it had been on land, but now it came with new dangers. Waves splashed over the gunwales, soaking the men in freezing seawater. Their clothes froze to their bodies. Ice formed on the oars, making them heavier with each stroke. "I can't feel my hands," one sailor cried out. "Keep rowing," Heemskerk commanded. "Stop rowing and we die." They made agonizingly slow progress. The coast of Novaya Zemlya seemed to stretch forever, an endless barrier of ice and rock between them and salvation. At night, they dragged the boats onto ice floes and huddled together for warmth, too exhausted to even speak. Barentsz was fading fast. The scurvy had ravaged his body during the winter, and the brutal conditions of the boat journey were killing him by inches. De Vere sat beside his captain during their rest stops, watching the life drain from the man who'd led them through hell. "Garrett," Barentsz said weakly one night, his voice barely audible over the wind. "You must get them home, promise me." "You'll get us home, Captain. We're not far now." "Don't lie to a dying man." Barentsz managed a thin smile. "I know what's happening to me. My teeth are gone. I can feel my body shutting down. But the rest of you, you can still make it. We won't leave you. You won't have to." Barentsz closed his eyes. "Just promise me my journal reaches Amsterdam and tell them we found it. The bay, the passage. It's there, even if we couldn't navigate it. Tell them others should try." "I promise," De Vere said, his throat tight. On June 20th, 1597, 1 week after leaving Het Behoudenhuis, William Barentsz died in the boat while his crew rowed onward. He died looking at the endless Arctic sky, the sun that never set, the ice that had defeated him. "Captain's gone," someone said quietly. The boat stopped. The crew sat in silence, processing the loss. Barentsz had been their rock, their leader, the man who'd kept them alive through the impossible winter. And now he was gone. "We bury him at sea," De Vere announced, his voice breaking. "It's what he would have wanted." They wrapped Barentz's body in sailcloth and said what prayers they could remember. Then they let him slip into the dark Arctic waters, committing their captain to the depths he'd spent his life exploring. "God keep you, William Barentsz," De Vere whispered. "You were a brave man and a good captain." "Now what?" asked Heemskerk, suddenly realizing the weight of command now fell on his shoulders. "Now we keep going," De Vere replied. "We get everyone else home, that's what he wanted." But death wasn't finished with them. Another crew member, weakened by scurvy and exposure, died 2 days later. Then another. The boats were becoming floating coffins. "We're not going to make it," someone said, voicing what everyone was thinking. "Yes, we are." Heemskerk's voice was firm. "We've come too far to quit now." They rounded the southern tip of Novaya Zemlya and began heading west, praying they'd encounter a ship or reach the Russian mainland. Their supplies were nearly exhausted. Men drank seawater in desperation, which only made things worse. Then on August 1st, 1597, a cry went up from the lead boat. "Sail! Sail to the west!" Every head turned. There on the horizon was a ship, a real ship, not a hallucination born of desperation. "Row, row for your lives!" The crew found strength they didn't know they had. Their arms burned, their backs screamed in agony, but they rowed like their lives depended on it, because they did. The ship spotted them, changed course, came closer. It was a Dutch merchant vessel, part of a fishing fleet working the waters near Kola Peninsula. "Who are you?" called the merchant captain, staring in disbelief at the skeletal figures in the open boats. "We are..." De Vere's voice failed him for a moment. "We are what remains of the William Barentsz expedition. We've been lost in the Arctic for nearly a year." "Barentsz, but we thought..." "Everyone thought you were dead." "Most of us are," De Vere replied, "but 12 of us are still alive, barely." The merchant ship took them aboard, gave them food, water, and dry clothes. The survivors could barely process their good fortune. After nearly a year in hell, they were rescued. In the ship's cabin, warm for the first time in months, De Vere opened his journal and began to write. "On this day, August 1st, 1597, we were rescued by Dutch merchants near the Kola Peninsula. Of the 17 men who set out with Captain William Barentsz, 12 survive. Our captain died on the journey home, but his courage and leadership gave us life when all seemed lost." The survivors reached Amsterdam in November 1597. They were celebrities immediately, the men who'd survived the impossible, who'd lived through an Arctic winter and returned to tell the tale. De Vere published his journal and it became a sensation. The 3 Voyages of William Barentsz was translated into multiple languages and read across Europe. People were horrified and fascinated in equal measure by the account of Het Behoudenhuis, the polar night, and the desperate escape. But more importantly, the expedition changed Arctic exploration forever. They'd proven that men could survive an Arctic winter with proper shelter and preparation. They'd mapped coastlines that had been unknown to Europeans. They'd left behind detailed records of the ice conditions, wildlife, and environmental challenges. Their journey established that the Northeast Passage, while incredibly dangerous, was theoretically navigable. It would be centuries before technology caught up with the dream, but Barentsz and his men had shown it was possible. Het Behoudenhuis stood undiscovered until 1871, when Norwegian seal hunters found it virtually intact. The shelter that had saved 12 men's lives had survived nearly 300 years of Arctic weather. Inside, they found artifacts, tools, cooking implements, books, and navigational instruments, time capsules of that terrible winter. Today, the Barents Sea bears William Barentz's name. It's a fitting memorial for a man who gave his life pushing the boundaries of the known world. The 12 survivors lived with their memories. They'd stared into the abyss and somehow crawled back. They'd lost friends, lost their captain, lost nearly everything. But they'd gained something too. They'd proven what humans could endure, what courage, leadership, and sheer determination could accomplish against impossible odds. What did we learn? An older De Vere was asked years later when discussing the expedition. We learned that the Arctic doesn't care about your courage or your plans. It will kill you without mercy if you're unprepared. But we also learned that human beings are capable of surviving things that should be impossible. We learned that leadership matters, that keeping hope alive matters, that even in the darkest night, literal or metaphorical, the sun will eventually rise again. He paused, his eyes distant, and we learned that some knowledge can only be bought with blood. Captain Barentsz paid that price. He died so that future explorers might live. That's his legacy. Not just the maps or the journals, but the proof that it could be done at all. The story of William Barentsz and his crew remains one of history's greatest survival tales. 12 men who refused to surrender to the ice, who built a house in hell and lived to tell about it, who sailed open boats through Arctic seas because going forward was the only way home. They were ordinary sailors who accomplished something extraordinary. And their story reminds us that the human spirit, when tested to its absolute limit, can sometimes, just sometimes, prove stronger than ice and darkness and death itself.